Okay, welcome to the whiteboard session here on section 3.0. We're going to be discussing gray matter and white matter and also what is a nuclei. So first, let's get a couple things squared away here. So if we're referencing what is gray matter versus white matter, so let's get a pen going here. So we'll say that gray matter versus white. Okay. So if we have these neurons, okay, and they all have cell bodies, a collection of these cell bodies. We also have a collection of neurons, glial cells. So we talked about what the neuron was in section 2.0. We talked about what the glial cells were. We also talked about synapses. So here we have each one of these cell bodies from a neuron with some sort of projection, which is their axons. I would say that the collection of neural cell bodies or glial cells and synapses all form your gray matter. Okay. And then I would say that the axon bundles are going to be your white matter. Okay. So with that understanding, then we could sort of look at like a generic brain, right? Generic brain here, and let's get a highlighter. If you look at a coronal section of it, you will see there is this darker portion of it around the periphery. Okay, we would say that this darker portion here, okay, is going to be this collection of neural cell bodies and glial cells and so forth. Okay, and then the projections will be going down and coming back. So you'll have axons that will be coming back up, sensory information, and then you'll be having motor axons that will be leaving the cell bodies and going back down. You also have projection fibers and association and commissural fibers. We'll talk about that coming up. You also have this concept of let's take a superior view of your brain. Okay, it is going to be separated into a left and a right hemisphere. And we have this thing called hemispheric lateralization. And we are referencing like specific functions within the hemispheres. So the entire brain, okay, so you have a single hemisphere is this one side. Okay, so you have two hemispheres, they're also called cortices. Okay. If we're referencing the cortex of the individual, if we're referencing the cortex here, okay, each lateral side, we would reference that as the cortices. So we can divide the brain into two hemispheres, into two cortices. And we have this sort of lateralization is what we call it of the hemispheres. And what we're talking about is like, so like typically you have on your left side of your brain, you have specific functions, okay? Functions, and these are going to be, I'm actually not going to write them out, but these are going to be like your logical side of the brain. So the left side of the brain is going to be doing language-based skills, so like reading, writing, analytical, mathematics, and logical type functions. It's going to be controlling hand movements as well from the premotor cortex, and you'll see somebody who is right-handed. So if a right-handed individual, you'll see sort of like the left premotor cortex, which is what we'll we'll talk a little bit about that coming up here. You'll see that that is much more developed in an individual who is right-handed than in the left hand, because we have some crossing over of our fibers that we'll also talk about in the future as well. So sensory, but sort of prep your brain, sensory information and motor information. A lot of these tracks are going from your, so motor might start from your left side of your brain, and it would be controlling the right side of your body, just as well as like your sensory information coming to the right side of the body is coming to the left side of the brain. Your right hemisphere, okay, your right hemisphere is going to have some functions, and these are going to be more like so I would say these are going to be more like identifying objects like touch, smell. So like sensory information from the environment. Okay, so touch, smell, sight, taste, feel, so tactile senses. And this is sort of the dominant lobe here that is involved in like facial recognition and three-dimensional relationships. Also references like your emotional cortex as well. So that is sort of like your artistic side. Some people call it the right side of your brain is your artistic side, where your left side is your more analytical, science or math type brain, your logical brain. And some of that's true. And that's kind of why they say is that lateralization, okay, and sort of division of functions. And then we'll go further to say that this cortex has even more duties, and just sort of like general outline duties. So we say that the cortex is processing information, right? So we have afferent and efferent signals that are coming out. We're having communication within the regions inside of the brain. So this is the cortex is going to be a lot of conscious, but also unconscious thought as well. Can be processed through it, but is very conscious thought. This is auditory, vision, language, memory, thought, awareness, perception, our attention. So all this is sort of a general, sort of broad function list of what is going on in our cortex. The sort of information is being processed there. Okay, so let's clear this out. Next thing I'd like to talk about, sort of how we divide the brain. So let's just sort of do a generic lateral. Okay, so lateral view of the brain, and so midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal column. Okay. So this is sort of a generic lateral view of the brain. Okay, so this over here is going to be anterior, and then this over here is going to be posterior. Okay. We can divide the brain into lobes. So we have our frontal lobe over here. So frontal lobe, we have our parietal lobe, we have our occipital lobe, we have our temporal lobe. Here is our midbrain. This is our cerebellum. So cerebellum. Okay. And then we have our pons, our medulla, and then we have our spinal cord. So we have our brain stem here, our hindbrain, or our small brain, and then our cerebrum. Okay. So the cortex is going to be the outer surface of all this. Okay. Then we can take some more landmarks. So when we had our superior view, we separated our brain from left and right with a longitudinal fissure. Okay, and that runs from anterior to posterior, right through the center of the brain. So superior view, longitudinal fissure runs anterior, posterior. That divides the left and the right brain. So now we can divide a anterior and posterior as well. Okay, fissure is going to be a deep groove. Okay, so it's a sulcus is going to be more of a shallow depression or a shallow groove. So this sulcus right here we refer to as the central sulcus. Okay, then we have another sulcus here that's going to divide the temporal lobe from the rest of the cerebrum, the other lobes here, and this is going to be referenced as the lateral. Okay, so the lateral sulcus and the central sulcus, okay, are helping to divide these lobes. So next, we can go on and say that there are some regions of the cortex. So we'll use our we can even use some different colors here. So let's go with a, let's say that our sensory information is going to be orange. Okay. We have an area right here. Okay. Just posterior to the central sulcus. And this region right here. Okay. We will, let's not like doing that. Let's go back to the pen. Okay. Here it is. Here it is first. Back to the pen. Okay. So this area right here, okay, just posterior to the central sulcus is what we call the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay. And all the information that is coming from the body, that sort of general somatic information that is sensory, pain, touch, vibration, all this stuff is sort of coming up from the body, from the environment, and it is hitting your primary somatosensory cortex. Okay. On the anterior side of the central sulcus, okay, we have what is called the primary motor cortex. So just like our sensory or our afferent signals were coming from the body and the environment, and they were hitting the primary somatosensory cortex, we are eliciting a response to our primary motor cortex, and we're going to send those efferent signals back down to the body. We also have some areas within the parietal lobe, okay, which is going to be just posterior to the primary cortex here for sensations. And this is what we're going to call a sensation or association area. We'll learn a little bit more depth about what an association area is coming up, but to sort of prep your brain on that, you have different sort of communication of your white fibers. Remember, we talked about the difference of gray and white matter. Your white matter is your axons. So you have different sort of bundles and tracks, okay, that we can identify. An association tract is pretty much a specific kind of bundle. So it's a communication. It's a highway of axons. Okay. So basically, information that is coming in as sensory information has to communicate with other parts of the brain. Okay, so if this is pain, or this is cold or something like that, or if this is so either one of those or any of the other somatic senses, these can come in and they're going to have to get processed, and they're going to have to utilize other areas of your brain like memory and sort of make associations of like hot and cold, and trigger other areas of your brain and work in conjunction with them. And then you'll have to communicate with your motor side of the brain. So all these are association fibers, and they're all processed as well in association areas that are relative to their primary cortex. Okay. We also have here on the very front of the brain. Okay, so we call this the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is going to be your higher order thinking, your executive functions, This is an area of the brain where if you get like a lesion or something or damage to this area, you lose that ability to have more higher logical thinking, or lose your inhibition. So individuals here might have a tumor pressing on this, or a lesion would maybe typically be normally a very, I would say, like even keeled individual, okay, very mild or mild tempered, we would say. And then this damage might cause them to start doing more rash things and living more rash, and maybe start gambling and drinking and smoking, not caring about their health or the concern of other people. So they would lose their inhibitions, right? So that is one of the big functions here in the prefrontal cortex. You have a occipital in your occipital lobe here, okay? You have a cortex within here, and this is your visual cortex, okay? And if we look at, let's do another side picture over here. So if we were to have, again, a lateral brain, okay, the brain, cerebellum, spinal cord, pons, medulla, and so we would say then that if we had our eyes down here, okay, so as we are perceiving a visual image, right, or light is hitting our retina, we're sending an afferent signal through our optic tract, and it is going through our optic chiasm, and then it is transferring over to some cell bodies we call a nuclei, a lateral geniculate, and then we have these sort of radiations of these signals, okay, and they're going through the temporal lobe and more inferior, and up through the parietal lobe, which is going to be more superior, and they're going to be hitting this portion of our cerebral cortex back here in the occipital lobe called the visual cortex. And so it's going to be processing that information, okay? And then there's going to need to be some like association area with it, just like we have an association area with our somatosensory cortex and our motor cortex. We have them with our visual cortex as well. We have some other like specialized cortex areas, and if you let me first draw another. Let's do. Okay, so let's just do a 1/2 here. So let's say that this is your left side of the brain. Okay, left side. Remember, we talked about left side is very specialized in like language skills, reading, writing, and so forth, right? So we have some specialized area of cortex as well. Let's go with another color here, okay? And this here is going to be the lateral sulcus, right? So if you look right here, we have that lateral sulcus dividing the parietal and the frontal lobe with the temporal lobe. Okay, so it's an order here. So the lateral sulcus, okay, is here. And then just on the very inside, okay, of the lateral sulcus here, you have cortex. And this cortex is going to be responsible for processing like taste. Okay, so this is what we call your gustatory cortex. Okay, and this has a name as well. So if we were to name this cortex on the brain, it is your insula. Okay. So the insula is where you sort of reflect. If you were to come to this portion of the brain here, so maybe we'll say it's probably about right here within the frontal lobe area. Okay. So if you were to reflect the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe here, okay, and look just deep, then you would see the gustatory cortex. And you also have along this region here, okay, you have some additional cortex that are going to be processing your all sort of sense of smell, okay, which is what we call your olfactory cortex. So you have your gustatory cortex, also named the insula, and your olfactory cortex along the lateral sulcus here. Okay, and so we put the same color here. So you'll find that here. Next, we have some auditory, so our auditory, our language centers, okay, and we have two important language centers. So we have one, let's say here, okay, and we also have one here, and these are sort of regional as well. So if you see this one that's in the posterior, okay, this is within the parietal lobe, and our parietal lobe is handling sensory information. So that's information coming in, right? So if we're interpreting language language signals that are coming in, right? So we would say that this is our interpretive language, okay, center. And we call this the Wernicke's, okay. The other one here, we call the Broca's, okay. And if you want to know the Brodmann's areas for these, Wernicke's is the number 22 area, and then Broca's is the number 44 and number 45. So that's for like your brain homunculus and brain mapping. Your Brodmann's areas have these are your numbers. The Broca's is going to be your motor. Okay, so we're in the frontal lobe, so we're in the motor region of the brain. So this is going to be expressive, okay, expressive language center. All right, and if you think about this, we have potential to have a damage, a lesion, or like an infarct in your brain that would affect this area of the brain. If you're talking specifically about the Broca's region, then you would have difficulty expressing your language here. And we call that Broca's aphasia. So an aphasia is sort of lack of language, right? A defect in language. And if it is here in the Broca's, it is expression. So the interpretive side of your language centers is working just fine. So understanding language and interpreting language is just fine. It's just when it comes to actually speaking. So individuals who have Broca's aphasia have very frustrated. They're very frustrated because their interpretation and their understanding is just fine, but it's when they go to speak, it doesn't come out right. And they struggle to speak as well, so it's sort of slow and difficult for them. Okay, so that's Broca's aphasia or expressive aphasia. Then you have interpretive, or what we say also receptive aphasia. You're receiving in the parietal, right? Interpretive language center, you have problems understanding and interpreting the language, but your motor ability to actually speak is intact, so you'll be able to speak very fluid. It just comes out with word salad. It's also frustrating for the individuals who are speaking with them. then you have a communication between these two centers, okay? And this is something that that we refer to as the R. Hewitt fasciculus, and oops, I'm going to cross that out as more of underlining here. So the arcuate fasciculus is a communication between the two. And if you have a lesion there, right? So if you have an brain infarct or a lesion that cuts the communication between these two centers, we have something called global aphasia. Okay. And this is the worst because then neither one of these are working well. So you have dual deficits. Okay. So you have a problem expressing language from the motor side and Broca's, and also problems with the interpretive language centers as well. I think that pretty much covers a lot of the points that I wanted to make for your cerebral cortex. And we can also say, though, that we have a cerebellar cortex. Okay, so just like we had cortex right here in the cerebrum, right? We also have cortex that is on the outer surface of the cerebellum. Okay, and when we talk about cerebellum, we're not going to go as much into depth, but your cerebellum is going to be very much involved in the functions of like fine movements, your equilibrium and balance, your posture. It's like motor learning and so forth. So you have a lot of motor and sensory information. We talked about in our first lecture, section 1.0, about the divisions of the nervous system. We talked about what like your locomotor system is, and this is like a collection of sensory information that is coming from your muscles, your joints, like your skeletal muscles, your joints, your ligaments, and it is collecting it and sending it back to your brain, and it's sort of processing three-dimensional space. It's working with the motor function of that as well, to sort of control those skeletal muscles, ligaments, and bones to create movements. And the cerebellum is very important because it allows it sort of integrates balance and fine motor movement. I talked about how when you close your eyes and you have so this proprioception, right? So it's a sense of three-dimensional space and equilibrium. It gives me the ability to sort of close my eyes, put my finger in front of me, take the opposing finger and bring it back to space, and then even with my eyes closed, be able to pretty much get close to touching them together, right? Certainly my hands. And the cerebellum is very active in being able to interpret and guide all that and interpret all that information coming from your locomotor system, and then being able to like guide your motor to be able to hit very specific, very fine movements, we'll say. Right, so you have a cerebellar cortex in addition to the cerebral cortex, and also, so we got our pen here. So I would say that the few things that I would want you to know about the cerebellar cortex is that it's divided into a anterior and a posterior. Okay, so you have an anterior and a posterior lobe, and it is separated by what I think is the primary fissure. Okay, and the posterior lobe, which is a much larger lobe, okay, it is then subdivided into a superior and an inferior portion of the posterior lobe. And the cerebellum, from a posterior view of the cerebellum, gross view, okay, you will see that it looks different from the cerebrum, where in the cerebrum we sort of have these gyri. Okay, so these folds, right? These folds with these smooth folds, and then we have these sulcuses and dentions and fissures, right? And sulcuses that run around in the brain. The cerebellum is more septated, okay? So it has these septations, right? Or lateral grooves projecting from either side, okay? And it is separated by what we call the vermis, okay? And just sort of interesting or what to make note of, I'd say, is if you have a lesion, right, in the cerebellum, we can divide this pretty much into two sections. So one is going to be medial. We can't see that very well. Medial versus lateral, okay, and lateral. So if you get a lesion on your lateral side of your cerebellum, we will say that you will have an ipsilateral dysfunction, okay? And we're talking about balance and things like that, right? Equilibrium, balance, posture, right? So individuals that have a right-sided, so say this is a right-sided lesion in their cerebellum, then they will typically like fall to their right side. So it's ipsilateral. Okay. If you have a lesion towards the center area here, then we call this sort of ataxia as a trunkal, or like a trunkal ataxia. So this is more the medial, your big primary movers of your hips and your abdomen and your trunk and so forth. So they'll have ataxia. Ataxia is problems with movement. Okay, so trunkal is medial, and lateral is going to be falling to your same side as wherever your lesion is. And so that will pretty much hit everything I want to say about the gray matter and what our cortexes are. Okay. Let's now talk a little bit about the white matter. So just to sort of go back in the beginning of this, we talked about gray matter, and the gray matter was this collection of cell bodies, right? And then the white matter is going to be the axons, right? So bundles of axons, and we can organize these in a few different ways. So do a generic brain here. Okay. And so we have these cell bodies, right? Just review, have their axons that are projecting down. Okay. This is your white matter. Okay. That's what we just discussed. And we can say that the white matter, okay, white matter is going to be a collection of myelinated axons. Okay. And this is in the central nervous system. Or we can say that they are nerves. We learned about what the differences were between a nerve and an axon. The nerves are generally just axons, but they're in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, and nerves are pretty much these are like tracks, or we'll say bundles, right, of axons. Okay, so it's white matter is either going to be like myelinated axons in your central nervous system, or those that are going to be in the peripheral nervous system, which we refer to as the nerve. So that's just sort of a recap. And there's the tracks. So we'll now talk about like tracks, and we'll say that a track is like oriented longitudinal. Okay, so now we can say we've got a midbrain, we've got pons and a medulla, and then a spinal cord. Okay, so this here. Okay, so let's do our white material here now in orange. So we can say then that a tract is something that we would have like oriented longitudinally here. So coming from projecting from the gray matter, or maybe coming up the spinal cord, right? And then it's maybe going all the way through to back up to the cell bodies as a afferent signal. Okay, so we have afferent signals coming up, being processed in the brain. We have efferent signals going back down, right? We have crossation, right? So we have some of the sensory and motor tracts. These bundles of axons are coming up to your what we call the reticular formation, which is located around the medulla oblongata, and this is a very key place where you have a lot of that decussation or crossing over of white matter and axons. Okay, so this is an area where we see a lot of the like sensory or motor tracts that are causing you to have this is like your right side of your brain, it's your left side of your brain. So if you're sending a motor signal from the right side of your cortex down to the left side of the body, it would decussate here. Okay, at the reticular formation within the medulla, right? So we have these tracks or these bundles. Okay, then we can further divide. So we'll say we have tracks, and we call them. Let's say that we have one commissural. Two, we have an association. We talked about those a little bit ago, the association areas. And then three, we'll talk about projections. Okay. So you need to sort of subdivide these tracks, and we'll say that let's go back to a blue, and let's look at a commissural. So this is a superior view of our brain. Okay. And we have a left and a right hemisphere. Okay. So these are two separate hemispheres of the brain, and we need to be able to process information because our logical side of the brain needs to talk to our artistic side of the brain. Okay, we have information that needs to be integrated from the left side of our body and the right side of our body, like senses, and then we need to integrate our actual special senses as well, and sometimes into this information. And we need to be able to then elicit responses, and we have all this crossing over. And so we will say that a commissural fiber, okay, so commissure means to cross over, okay. We have these tracks that are going right, left and right, okay. So your biggest commissural fiber, all right, is they're communicating. It's very thick, and if you do a lateral section of the brain, okay, let's just do a little bit more here. Let's do a lateral section of the brain. So the other one called the corpus callosum, and it is a tract, so there's a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. It's myelinated, and it communicates from hemisphere to hemisphere. Okay, so commissural fiber, commissural means crossing over, and these are axons that connect two hemispheres with each other. And an example of that is like the corpus callosum. We also have something called the anterior commissure. There's some other commissures that we have, but the corpus callosum is going to be the biggest one, okay, in your central nervous system. And then we have association fibers. Okay, association fibers. I think of these. So these are connecting. These are axons that are connecting like regions within the brain. Okay, so we're on the same side of the hemisphere. Okay, but let's say that we have one region here. Okay, a cortex area that needs to communicate with a deep layer or another area of the cortex, right? So we have these communications, right? And they are found in association areas as well. Okay, so we have communication with our primary motor cortex. It's just anterior to the central sulcus, and it is communicating with its association area, right? So we have association areas. So I say a lot of association fibers are running anterior to posterior, okay, but they're within the same hemisphere, okay, so they're not crossing over. So associations are within the same one. And we have some examples of this. So we talked about arcuate fasciculus. Okay, arcuate fasciculus was communicating between the Broca's and the Wernicke's area and our language centers. Okay, arcuate itself is referencing to a short fiber, and a fasciculus is kind of like the longitudinal fasciculus, right? We have that. I'm sorry, fissure. We have so don't confuse fasciculus with fissure. A fasciculus is a long fiber. Let me say, we have the arcuate fasciculus, though, which is that communication fiber between your Broca's area and your Wernicke's area and your language processing center. Okay. Then we have, let's do a green. We have projection fibers. So projection fibers are communicating within region, basically connecting region, each region to other parts of the brain. So they're pretty much connecting like the cortex. So we have one that is connecting from the cortex to sort of like your basal layers of the brain. So you have other functions that are going on in the brain here, other regions. Okay, so they're connecting basal layers of the brain to the cortex, or they're connecting to regions within the spinal cord. Okay, and you have these projections. Okay, so if you look at a lateral side, you're going to have axons that are communicating from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. You're going to have them communicating from your pons and your medulla to the cerebellum. You're going to have tracts coming, projecting longitudinally, going into the cerebellum. We'll say longitudinally coming up into the brain. Then we're going to have projections within the brain, okay, to more basal layers of the brain. We're going to have them up in the cortex. So we're going to have projections of fibers going to the cortex, okay, and then back down to the cerebellum. And so yeah, we have all this communication between regions, okay, within the cortex, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. And I would say that projections are highly involved with communication between those three components: cerebrum, brainstem, and then spinal cord. Okay. So one of the common projections that are referenced is going to be the internal capsule. And if you, so let's get rid of this here. Okay, let's go with another color here. We have within our basal layer of the brain, okay, so sort of around where the thalamus is. Okay, so the midbrain is right here. So say at the top of the midbrain, so you would have a thalamus that is in this area. You would have a hypothalamus below it, and epithalamus, and pineal gland sort of behind that as well. Then I would say that also, like midline, you have some nuclei, and we'll talk a little bit about nuclei here as well. You have these structures, okay, and these structures here are what we call the basal ganglia. Okay, you can find them more medial to the lateral sulcus. Okay, they're lateral to the midline of the brain, and we have a nucleus here, which is called the caudate nucleus. We have the putamen here, and then these two structures are called the globus pallidus. And if you look at these two structures here, we'll draw them like this. Okay, you have the interna and externa of the globus pallidus. Okay, so it's these two small structures right here. Okay, and what I want to say is that if we want to define what a nuclei is, because we've been talking about nuclei, if you talk about your cranial nerves, you have to really talk in depth about the nuclei, because each one of your cranial nerves has a respective nuclei associated with it. Okay, so collection of like cell bodies that are sort of processing that information, right? It's connected to the neurons and the cell body in the tract associated with that cranial nerve. You'll find those all throughout the brain stem. And if we want to define now what a nuclei is, okay, let's sort of go back. We have our definition here, right? Let's just review those again. We have the cell bodies, and there's a collection of cell bodies together. They form a cortex, or gray. They're found within our cortex, but they form a gray matter. The white matter are the axons. Well, we would say that if we have a cell body, okay, and it has a projection, an axon, right? Let's say that this is located here, for instance, in our pons. We have a cranial nerve, okay? So we have the cell body, a collection of these cell bodies that are within the pons, and then they have a projection coming lateral to the pons, and then maybe branch out to the face. Okay, we would then so we're sort of describing what our cranial nerve number 5 is, right? So our trigeminal nerve. This has a nuclei within the pons, and we would say that a nuclei is a collection of cell bodies. So let's just do a few more generic ones around it, right? So kind of like our gray matter, right? So we would say that a nuclei is a collection of gray matter. but it is surrounded, okay, by white matter. And the white matter, of course, is the axons, right? So if you go here in the brainstem, you have all these bundles and tracks. It's a information highway, right? And if you put gray matter, okay, within that, within these information highways, right, you'll end up with gray matter surrounded by white matter. So that's what that is what a nuclei, okay, and nuclei. And this nuclei is not like a nucleus, right? So a nucleus is like our neuron, right? And it's a projection here, or axon. The nucleus, right, has a genetic material. It's within a cell, so it's chromosomes. That's a nucleus. And nuclei, in referencing to the different sorts of matter, gray matter, white matter in your nervous system. Nuclei is a collection of gray matter surrounded by white matter. Okay, and these basal ganglia are actually nuclei. Okay, so what you have here is a collection of neuronal cell gray matter. Okay, gray matter, and you have axons that are going around all of these. Okay, and they're projecting up. So these are the same axons that are coming from the spinal cord or leaving the brain, or going through anterior, posterior. So these are commissural fibers. These are association fibers and projection fibers. Okay, but they're white fibers, or they're information highways that are surrounding this gray matter. Okay, and this we'll see it green here now. So this whole area right here, okay, that involves the nuclei and the white matter tracks, the nuclei of your basal ganglia. This is what we refer to as the internal capsule. Okay. And another thing I would like to point out as well, to sort of give a little bit of like a ending to this discussion. Okay, we have a section of our midbrain here. Okay, and let's actually give me just a moment. Let's pull out. So here we go. So we have a section of our midbrain, and we have an area, okay. This is anterior, this is posterior. Okay. No, sorry, posterior, anterior. I'm getting mixed up. On the anterior portion of your midbrain, okay, you have an area, a dark area called the substantia niagara. Okay, and within the substantia niagara, okay, you are synthesizing dopamine. Okay, and dopamine is going to be intricately involved with the basal ganglia. All right. This whole apparatus here, the caudate putamen and the globus pallidus, right? Let's go ahead and draw them out, since we sort of have it here. So we have the putamen, and we have the caudate nucleus. So these structures here, caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, internus, and externus. These are referenced as basal ganglia. Okay, basal ganglia. All right. And what's going to happen is this is a super oversimplification. Okay, so we're not talking about the individual pathways within the basal ganglia, but what I want to do is I want to point out how, let's say dopamine here is pink. Okay, so we are synthesizing dopamine in our substantia nigra. Okay, and what happens is it comes up and it is dopamine. Okay, dopamine is being used in multiple different pathways for your basal ganglia to communicate with each other and to ultimately send a signal, okay, to your thalamus. And we're going to say that your thalamus is a big relay station, okay, but it is intricately involved in movements, okay. So what I'm getting at here is that we have a condition that we call, write it down here, Parkinson's disease. Okay. And Parkinson's disease is a movement disorder, and individuals who have Parkinson's disease, they have what's called a resting tremor. It's called a pill rolling. It's a form of chorea. Pill rolling meaning like rolling a pill between your fingers. So when they're at rest, they will commonly be doing this with their fingers. So it's a form of tremor. They have rigidity. It's called cogwheel rigidity. So if you were to turn a cogwheel, it's not very smooth, right? So when they walk, it's very rigid, right? They have something called akinesia. Akinesia is kinesia, kinesthetic is movement. Put an A before it, so it's lacking of or without movement. You could say bradykinesia, so a decrease in movement. They have what's called postural instability, so they have an inability to maintain their posture. Okay, and then they have something. Basically, there's other stuff that we're not going to go into, but it's a movement disorder. They particularly have problems like with initiation of movement. Generally, if you can get them up and get them moving, they're a little bit more fluid. But what happens is that the substantia nigra here, okay, isn't producing enough dopamine, and dopamine is not exclusively, but it is the neurotransmitter, okay, and it is being used within the pathways of the basal ganglia, okay, to communicate to the thalamus, right, ultimately to initiate movement. So if you have a decrease, okay, of dopamine within the substantia nigra, then you are going to have a decrease of dopamine within this pathway and ultimately a decrease in movement. And that's a very oversimplification of how this works, but that is sort of like a very basic description of what Parkinson's disease is. And I think let's go ahead and just wrap this lecture up. So that will conclude the lecture number 3, neurophysiology, and discussion of our gray matter, white matter, our nuclei, and the sorts of cortex that we have. Okay. Thank you.